Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this frosty, frosty day to the first lecture of the spring semester in Scientia's continuing series on constructing the human being. It is a tremendous pleasure today to be able to introduce Thomas R. Cole. He is the Beth and Toby Grossman Professor and Director of the McGovern Center for Health Humanities and the Human Spirit at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. He's also the Chauvin Visiting Professor in the Department of Religious Studies here at Rice. He graduated from Yale, Wesleyan with an MA, and the University of Rochester, where he received his PhD in history. Dr. Cole has published many articles and several books on the history of aging and humanistic gerontology. His book, The Journey of Life, A Cultural History of Aging in America, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. He is senior editor of What Does It Mean to Grow Old, Duke 1986, The Handbook of Humanities and Aging, Springer 1992, and Voices and Visions Towards a Critical Gerontology, Springer 1993. The New Yorker noted his co-edited Oxford Book of Aging as one of the most memorable books of 1995. His most recent co-edited book is Practicing the Medical Humanities, 2003. Cole's interest in the life stories of older people has taken him into biography and filmmaking. In 1994, he encountered Eldridge Stearns, hospitalized psychiatric patient who claimed he was the, quote, original Texas integration leader, end quote. Their collaboration resulted in a book, No Color Is My Kind, The Life of Eldridge Stearns and the Desegregation of Houston, 1997, and an accompanying film, The Strange Demise of Jim Crow, broadcast nationally on over 60 PBS stations and internationally by the State Department. The documentary received numerous awards and was nominated for a regional Emmy and a National Humanities Medal. Cole's film, Still Life, The Humanity of Anatomy, was an official selection at the Double Take Documentary Film Festival in April 2002. This work explores the special yet unstated relationship between medical students in the anatomy lab and the people who donate their bodies for dissection. In 2001, Cole's writing workshop program for elders was featured in the PBS documentary Life Stories. Both films probe relationships between present and past, the living and the dead, as crucibles of moral and spiritual development. Most recently, Cole co-produced Living with Stroke, a film about the invisible world of stroke survivors, which will be broadcast and distributed in 2007. Cole's work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, Voice of America, PBS, and at the United Nations. He serves as an advisor to the United Nations NGO Committee on Aging, the Union for Reform Judaism's Department of Family Concerns, and various editorial and foundation boards. In 2004-2005, he served as a consultant to the President's Council on Bioethics Project on Aging, recently released in print as Taking Care. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Cole as he will speak on aging and the changing nature of the human.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I think it's possible that individuals living in the 24th century will look back and judge us for allowing ourselves to grow old. Maybe death will be conquered too, and then we'll be judged for not doing something more about that. So does that mean that death and aging are pathologies that are to be combated? Those are the kinds of questions that I'll be dealing with in the first part of the talk that I want to give today. This is new material for me. I really haven't spent much time looking at the bioengineering and biotechnology literature, but I'm really interested in the key debates over bioengineering and the nature of the human and the post-human, and the arguments for or against this kind of unfettered biotechnological research, and Francis Fukuyama's claim that there is such a thing as human nature. So the first part of my talk will be devoted to try to give you some feel for the key players in that debate and what they have to say. The second part of the talk will be a discussion of anti-aging medicine, life extension, and biogerontology. In the last 15 or 20 years, we've had an explosion of interest in anti-aging medicine. I mean, just the rhetoric itself makes my hair curl. There are over 12, maybe there may be as many as 15,000 anti-aging doctors. And by anti-aging doctor, what I mean is somebody who pays $3,000 and fills out a couple of forms and then hangs out a shingle as anti-aging. There are probably 2,500 board-certified geriatricians, people who've been through geriatric fellowships in the country. And if you look at that imbalance, you can see something about the appeal of anti-aging medicine and the amount of research and technical expertise embedded in it. I won't hide my my view that it's basically a form of hucksterism. So I'll talk about bioengineering and concepts of human nature. I'll talk about anti-aging medicine and some of the issues of life extension and biogerontology, arguments for enhancement, arguments that we should live much longer, and I will suggest that we have to have good reasons for wanting to live longer. We have to have justifications, and that unless we find justifications in the visions of a good life that transcends the self, I think we're barking up the wrong tree. Okay, so let me begin by just giving you some thoughts from an edited collection called "Is Human Nature Obsolete? Genetics, Bioengineering, and the Future of the Human Condition," edited by Harold Bailey and Timothy Casey. What they do is they've pulled together a collection that deals with most of the research on the philosophical and theological significance of contemporary bioengineering. They write, "Ours is an age of biotechnology. While previous ages have had technology, what distinguishes modern technology from all other types, both pre-modern and non-Western, is its exclusive focus on the perfection of technical procedures and processes that had historically been subordinate to supra-technical norms and standards, usually of a moral, political, and religious nature." In other words, all previous cultures subordinated technology to a religious or moral or natural vision of what a good life was. And so the upshot, as they say, is that technical progress has been radically separated from humanistic reflection. This is something that I've noted in my own work on aging for quite a long time, that we have this, especially in the United States, we have a basic assumption that what we ought to be doing is generating and accumulating an endless amount of health and wealth without any notion of what it's for, without any notion of what we should be doing when we've got the wealth, when we've got the age, when we've got the health. And today we're in a situation where the dominant culture, traumatized by fear of aging, especially people like myself, baby boomers, is trying to abolish aging. I mean, you try to, even the term aging, it's being wiped out of public discourse. And it's being replaced by longevity because it has the taint of decay, and that's something that none of us want to do. Okay. So here's some of the questions that this volume raises for us. Should we, for example, be concerned that humanity could evolve into cyborgs? That is, beings whose physiology depends on electronic or mechanical devices. Which might mean that in some sense human beings as we know them today would not exist. Or should we understand the political rhetoric that wants to limit and control bioengineering as yet another manifestation of xenophobia, comparable to racism? Should we be concerned that the human body could be recreated in such a way as to make it breathe underwater or live 200 years? That was the Mel Brooks 2,000-year-old man coming through here. 200 years. Or is such hesitation merely an expression of a fear of knowledge and the uncertainty that comes with progress? And finally, in recreating the human body, are we reducing it to raw material, or are we elevating it? Are we perfecting it? One of the essays in this volume by Langdon Winter notes that for many of our contemporaries, the abolition of the human is no longer to be regarded as a distasteful possibility. Indeed, such possibilities are widely cherished as a marvelous intellectual challenge, a path to future profits, an opportunity for artistic fulfillment, and an occasion for exquisite personal transcendence. Some proponents think that finally human beings are beginning to grow up, which I think means because they can pretty much increasingly control the terms of their own existence. Lee Silver is another important advocate of the post-human condition. His provocative book is entitled Remaking Eden, Cloning and Beyond in a Brave New World. He imagines a society that, due to biotechnological developments, undergoes a revolution, and it's characterized by a clash between inferior and superior genetic classes. He suggests that previous generations have denied that they were playing God, but today's scientists seem to celebrate this. As James Watson, discoverer of the DNA double helix, announced at a scholarly symposium, he said, and another thing, because no one has the guts to say it, if we could make better human beings by knowing how to add genes, why shouldn't we do it? What's wrong with it? Later, addressing members of the British Parliament in May of 2000, Watson exclaimed, but then, in all honesty, if scientists don't play God, who will? And of course, advocates of the post-human condition are not limited to biotechnology. They include advocates such as the physicist Freeman Dyson, computer scientists Marvin Minsky, Raymond Kurzweil, Hans Moravec, and Kevin Warwick. If you think about this theologically, the idea seems to be that God's original creation was inadequate. And if we are created in God's image, then it's our job to create it perfection. Donna Haraway, among feminists and postmodernists, is a prominent advocate for the postmodern, post-human condition. And as she puts it, the primary responsibility of feminist theory and the new science studies is to call all boundaries into question and to deconstruct and thereby reject all claims about wholeness. So she would be quite nervous about a term like humanity, an essentialist term, because of its tendency to mask differentiation, mask the oppression of women, and therefore and still attribute power to those who hold the knowledge. Of course, the essayist Winter is one of the writers who's centrally concerned about the post-human condition and worries that as scientists push us increasingly in this direction, that we give up an important grounding for our ethics, which he calls our common humanity. It doesn't really specify it. But in thinking about it today in my class, Tanya's sitting there, I don't know why he came for this twice. I think the body is what it is. I mean, having bodies is what is universal. Bodies that die may be the common denominator. And of course, you may know people who want to upload their brains into some electronic medium and don't need their bodies. Well, Fukuyama's probably the most important person pushing back against advocates for posthumanism. Many of you are familiar with the book that made him famous, The End of History and the Last Man, where he used Hegel to argue that liberal democracy was the end of history. One of the things that's happened to Fukuyama in the meantime, he still believes that on political grounds, but he's come to see that how can there be an end? He's come to ask the question, how can there be an end of history if there's no end of science? In other words, if advances in biotechnology yield changes in human nature, then perhaps post-human beings will create a new political order. So he's open to the possibility that he's wrong. Fukuyama, in his new book, 2002, Our Post-Human Future, spent some time with George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, those 20th century dystopias. 1984 dealt with the information revolution and its potential for political centralization and oppression, and Brave New World dealt with advances in biotechnology, but it moved in a different direction, suggesting that everybody can be quite happy and lulled to sleep. Fukuyama suggests that the technological predictions of these two dystopias have been confirmed and correct, but that instead of becoming an instrument of centralization and tyranny, technology has led to the opposite, the democratization of access to information and the decentralization of politics. Well, I think there's a lot of truth to this, that there has been a lot of decentralization as there have been more and more access to information. But at the same time, there's been an increased capability for surveillance. And the particular kind of oppressive surveillance that bothers me are the new attachments that you see on traffic lights, so that a cop doesn't have to be there with his radar gun to catch you. They can catch you just with technology. I'm taking my BB gun out at one of those oppressive surveillance machines the next time I go out. Okay. In Brave New World, nobody really gets hurt. It's a world in which disease and social conflict have been abolished, and there's no depression, no madness, loneliness or emotional distress. Sex is good and readily available. No one takes religion seriously any longer. No one's introspective. No one has unrequited longings. The biological family has been abolished, and no one reads Shakespeare. Fukuyama points out that millions and millions of high school students have written essays on Brave New World. And he further suggests that the A papers will probably all say pretty much the same things. That people in Brave New World may be happy and healthy, but they've ceased to be human beings. They no longer struggle, aspire, love, feed, feel pain, make difficult moral choices, have families, or do any of the other things we traditionally associate with being human. So Fukuyama writes, the aim of this book, Our Post-Human Future, is to argue that Huxley was right and that the most significant threat posed by contemporary biotechnology is the possibility that it will alter human nature and move us into a post-human stage of history. This is important, I will argue, because human nature exists, is a meaningful concept, and has provided a stable continuity to our experience as a species. It is, conjointly with religion, what defines our most basic values. Human nature shapes and constrains the kind of possible kinds of political regimes, and so in the same way, technology powerful enough to reshape what we are will have possibly malign consequences for liberal democracy and the nature of politics itself. Fukuyama's response to the dangers of biotechnology is that we should regulate them. and that if our state, if the United States itself is incapable, then we should pull together international consortia to come to agreements on how to regulate this biotechnology. And he thinks we need to do it quickly and soon. One of the critics of Fukuyama is a theologian named Elaine Graham. And she points out that nature, I mean, her basic thrust is to try to undo what she sees as tendencies to objectification and essentialism in Fukuyama, and allow both nature and humanity to locate ultimate value and meaning in a divine rather than an anthropocentric horizon. This is an interesting move. It's not a move that's common in the academy. She doesn't really specify what theology, what worldview, but it's provocative and offers a different way of looking at things rather than staying simply on the secular and political realm. So Fukuyama has basically 4 ways that biotechnologies shape human destiny. First, new insights into genetic technology, genetic and the neurological basis of human behavior. Second, developments in neuropharmacology. Third, advances in molecular biology to increase life expectancy. And fourth, genetic engineering, both somatic and germline. Fukuyama worries that the prolongation of life will create social problems, such as impacting voting, employment, and family structure. And I agree with him here. One of the things that ethicists have suggested is that a radical prolongevity technology will generate new forms of inequality. Because if you look at health and longevity now, and you graph it against wealth, the graphs are identical. The wealthier you are, the healthier you're going to be. And it only stands to reason that with new technologies that are promote radical prolongevity, people with more wealth are going to have access to the technologies, and there's simply, inequality will simply be intensified. So Fukuyama wants our discourse of human rights to be safeguarded. And he says it cannot be founded on a residual religious sentiment of humanity made in the image of God. He says it has to be grounded in objective moral qualities to human nature that are derived from a shared genetic endowment. Now, he refers to this somewhat vaguely as the X factor, or the factor X, the decisive element constituting what it means to be distinctly human, insofar as it is common to the whole of humanity. Factor X provides the bedrock for universal human rights. There are aspects of human nature that we think we understand all too well, or would want to change if we had the opportunity, he writes. But doing nature one better isn't always that easy. Evolution may be a blind process, but it follows a ruthless adaptive logic that makes organisms fit for their environments. And the qualities that the X factor, this genetic endowment, supports that make people essentially human are emotion, reason, creativity, intelligence, and moral value. It's not clear, however, why we couldn't have radical changes to our bodies and still continue to have those qualities, which would, by his definition, allow us to continue to be human. There are a lot of appeals to nature as a way to ground moral value. And as we found in a large project that we worked on, sponsored by the Ford Foundation, into the concepts of nature and their implications, the ambiguity and complexity and disagreement about the term of nature is so pervasive as to make it impossible to derive any unified moral guidance from it as a concept. And so I think this is something that that counts against Fukuyama in a pretty serious way. On the other hand, Elaine Graham suggests in her critique of him that we need thicker, more pluralist accounts which appreciate the extent to which human nature is actually a compound of the two terms. It is both about being distinctively and uniquely human, largely through our capacity for culture, fabrication, and imagination, human and natural, insofar as our survival is dependent on our interdependence and affinity with all living things. Okay, so much for part one. Now what I want to do is spend some time thinking with you about anti-aging medicine and the challenges of human enhancement. The recent maturation of biogerontology is an excellent example of the radical enhancement technologies that are emerging from biomedical research. The economic, social, and ethical dynamics of anti-aging interventions were very nicely outlined a few summers ago in an issue of the Hastings Center report edited by Jungst and Binstock. And they noted that biotechnology was already struggling with the prospects that its findings might be applied to produce unprecedented longevity, one of the most dramatic and far-reaching aspects of biomedicine's potential to re-engineer the human. Biogerontologists are divided between those who labor to understand the basic mechanisms of aging, so-called normal aging, in order to identify and remove pathologies, and those who labor in search of anti-aging interventions. Scientists who embrace the goal of controlling aging suggest that we may be only a decade away from what they call engineered negligible senescence or aging reversal. I don't know how many pills there are going to be when they produce the first engineered negligible senescence, but I know there will be a run on them. Well, among the serious biogerontologists, most of them are in the business of studying so-called normal aging, the basic physiological mechanisms of aging. But both camps work together to repudiate anti-aging medicine. The entrepreneurs I was talking about, the morally questionable clinicians who make false claims that effective anti-aging medicine has already arrived. Well, in terms of the treatment and enhancement debate, we might say that those who study the basic mechanisms of aging are seeking treatments, while those who look for anti-aging interventions are seeking enhancement. So many of you may be or may not be familiar with this debate in the last decade or so over treatment and enhancement. What is the legitimate goal for medicine to pursue? Only treatment of pathology to bring pathology back to normality, or enhancement to become taller, to become smarter, to you name it. The distinction between treatment and enhancement is very unclear, and it's always subject to debate. It's artificial, it's socially constructed, just as the definition between the normal and the pathological are difficult and doesn't really hold up. And I suppose this is probably a consequence of what's happened just to our intellectual culture in the last 25 or 30 years, where from the Victorian dualisms that used to hold up, like normal and pathological, they just don't work anymore. I think maybe the only ones I can remember from the 1950s that still hold up are Ozzie and Harriet and AM and FM. Analog and digital might hang on, but they too may be swept into the dustbin of history. Okay. Most gerontologists agree that aging is not a disease, but it consists of biological processes that create the major risk factors for the pathologies of old age. Leonard Hayflick, who is an anatomist who discovered that cells have a limit number of doublings, I think 50 doublings, is one of the primary anchors of the normal aging camp. He writes, aging is not a disease, hence seeking a cure for it is tantamount to seeking a cure for embryogenesis or child or adult development. But other researchers and their popularizers have no hesitation in seeking medical benefits or the potential cure of aging. Arthur Kaplan, well-known bioethicist at University of Pennsylvania, has no trouble calling aging a disease because of the pathological, so-called pathological things, dimensions of it that most of us in this room would surely agree we would do better without. The regulation of anti-aging products is affected by by this persistent ambiguity over whether aging is a disease or a natural biological process. If anti-aging products were limited to specific pathologies, writes Eric Jungst, they could count as drugs or medical devices. They would count as drugs or medical devices, and proof of safety and efficacy would be required before they could be marketed. But if aging is not considered pathological, anti-aging products will be assessed like cosmetic medicines, such as non-prescription contact lenses, breast implants, liposuction, and Botox. See, the implications of using or not using these distinctions are quite serious. This pragmatic argument, that's what Jungst is doing here, it's a pragmatic argument against retaining the therapy enhancement distinction. In order to, if you just slip it all under therapy, then these products will be subject to FDA regulation. Although there's no currently marketed intervention that's been proved to slow or stop or arrest human aging, and some of them are actually quite dangerous, the use of anti-aging products grew dramatically in the 1990s, and anti-aging medicine earned some of the trappings of legitimacy. As I mentioned before, Ronald Klatz is the spearhead of anti-aging medicine. As I mentioned before, there are probably 15,000 members of the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, and it campaigns aggressively against mainstream gerontology and geriatrics, which is really interesting to see, to be honest with you. I mean, gerontology and geriatrics have been such a legitimized, solid enterprise since 1974, when the National Institute on Aging was established, that there's almost nothing has shaken these people, these institutional leaders. So to watch the anti-aging doctors like Ronald Klatz take aim at them and really shake them up and rile them is a really interesting thing. Even though I disagree with Klatz and anti-aging, to have diversity in the field is always much better than simply to have one group that holds hegemony over the rest. Well, as I said before, there's a large group of Americans, in particular baby boomers, who share the dream of anti-aging. And they will quickly continue to consume enhancement products and interventions. And these issues, I think, will be with us for quite a while. There may be three basic lessons from this look at sort of the ethics and regulation of anti-aging medicine. First, we should do what we can to avoid the dangers of premature commercial exploitation of scientific findings. Second, we need to face the challenge of philosophical pluralism. Methods of herbal medicine, acupuncture, meditation, and so on in medicine. We need to welcome these in the name of philosophical pluralism. And finally, we need to have open deliberations that anticipate rather than react to the social repercussions of new medical technologies. And we are about to to enter into really important debates about life extension. And I hope we can have those debates and have some consensus before the products are ready and upon us. So as I said before, I think the basic question when we're thinking about pro-longevity or enhancement is what vision of the good life does enhancement serve? That is, every culture before ours has seen health as a means to an end, right? A means to being more Christ-like, a means to doing more mitzvot, as a means to serving God, as a means to being a good servant of the community. But our culture seems to have made made health into a God itself. And this will not do in terms of giving us any guidance about how we want to use the new technology that we have. So I think we need to avoid the mindless accumulation of health and wealth that really underlies so much of our popular culture, and that is inherent in the mainstream definition of successful aging, which really boils down to functioning. Functioning. There's nothing wrong with functioning, but why would you call it successful? Success to do what? Function to do what? So I would certainly not rule out all anti-aging interventions on the basis of any fixed idea of the human or of the natural lifespan. But where do we turn for normative guidance? I think we need to turn to the communities, the defining communities that we live and work in. And so I turn, in my tradition as a Jew, I turn to Abraham Heschel, who, and in particular, his book, Who is Man?, published in 1965. It's a slim volume. It was based on the Fred West Memorial Lectures on Immortality, Human Conduct, and Human Destiny that was given at Stanford in 1963. Barely 20 years after the Holocaust and World War II, Heschel described what he called the Eclipse of Humanity. He writes, "Today, the humanity of man is no longer self-evident, and the issue is, how can a human being achieve certainty of his humanity?" And we can forgive him for the masculine pronouns, since this was early in the 1960s. Heschel's volume reminds us that human being is not identical to being human. Being human, as Heschel understood it, is a goal and a process that can be more or less successful. That's what the humanities are about. But becoming more human, a process that can only unfold with the passage of time, is especially difficult in a technological culture which instrumentalizes the self. The self becomes an object I can manipulate rather than an ever-changing inner experience in need of meaning and purpose. So, working in the spirit of Franz Rosenzweig's critique of metaphysics, Heschel doesn't only ask the purely philosophical question, what is man? He also asks the existential question, who is man? We cannot simply know the answer to this question. We must live it. The Jewish tradition grapples with this question by affirming, in Heschel's word, that to be is to be commanded. Jews belong to a covenant from which they cannot retire. But of course, that is precisely what many American Jews do, whether they belong to a congregation or not. It's very hard to know what it means to live covenantally in later life, whatever tradition you're in. Heschel was also concerned about what he called authentic human existence. He warned against the trivialized existence that emerges when ritual and prayer give way to a life of hobbies and recreation. In a talk he gave in 1961 to the White House Conference on Aging entitled To Grow in Wisdom, he lamented the arid spiritual landscape of old age in a society preoccupied with possessing things and ill-equipped to sanctify time. He saw the Sabbath as the model for the celebration and sanctification of existence in old age, a model which I don't really think works because it neglects the society's need for participation and engagement in later life. So I think without a radical change in our ideas about aging, and one way to put this is, unless we can begin to see aging as a mystery to be lived meaningfully rather than a problem to be solved, it's possible that life extension will actually contribute to a moral and spiritual dehumanization. If longer, enhanced lives emerge under the reigning regime of individualism, control, and the instrumentalized self, healthy older people may not become more human or more spiritually and morally developed, but quite the opposite. They may continue to function according to whatever norms seem to apply to them in particular, rather than according to norms in some defining community of values. And in this case, prolongevity might lead us into a gerontocracy of the rich and a tragedy of the commons. So I think I'll stop and see if we have some time for questions. Dr. Lomax.
Now, do you have any vision for the kind of format in which authentic discussion would take place about the trade-offs with increasing aging population, awareness of the limited resources, and what the implications are of a increasing aging population for what the rest of the society doesn't get and doesn't have?
Would you repeat the first part of that?
Where would you have this discussion, an authentic discussion? I don't think it takes place any place in the United States, at least right now.
Well, I don't have much expertise, if any, in policy, but my thought would be obviously we need ideas from the academy, and perhaps a project, but we couldn't do it without serious political engagement from people who make policy, without state legislators at least, or federal legislators, hearings. But it can't be done, I think, it can't be done absent the context of some kind of commitment to policy. I mean, yes, I would want faith communities there. Absolutely. As long as they play by the same rules everybody else plays by, right? Which is your one voice among many. Yeah, absolutely, I would want faith communities.
Thank you. You didn't say a word about the number one intellectual problem human beings have collectively, and that's facing 6.5 billion people with a carrying capacity of planet Earth, questionable, of about 3 billion people. Now, what do your studies tell you about what attitude we ought to take about negative population growth?
Well, I've never really thought seriously about that. I know the German population is shrinking because they're not replacing themselves. And sex and death are twins. So you could say, if we radically prolong life, we don't need reproduction as much, right? So that would be one possible implication of radically prolonged life would be radically fewer children. More than that, I don't really have any wisdom on the subject.
I think we ought to search for it quickly.
Okay.
I also am very concerned about the pressures of overpopulation on resources. But it occurs to me in listening to your talk that anti-aging as a thought process or goal is not necessarily the same thing as being anti-death. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the extent to which those two terms are synonyms and where they're not.
Okay. Let me just go back to the previous question and suggest something unusual, which is, and Anthony Trollope suggested this in a novel called The Fixed Period in 1880. You could have people who reach the age of 70 go into a necropolis and study for a year and then be chloroformed. And that would that would just wipe out a whole cohort of people 70 and over, and you wouldn't have to deal with people over 70. That's one way of handling, the population problem.
Could we raise that to 90?
Right. If it's my life, it's different. Yeah, that's right. That's. Would you repeat that? Where we were? You were concerned about.
The degree to which anti-aging,
Oh, yeah.
being anti-aging and being anti-death are synonyms or not being synonyms.
Yeah. Well, I think my own view is that what's ideal is what people have called a compression of morbidity, and which is a fancy term for saying, let's say we'd like the average age at death to be 85 or 90, whatever. If we can compress dementia and frailty and limitations and cancer, limitations from cancer, and to within a year or so of when people die, that would be a wonderful use of anti-aging. See what I mean? And that's one of the dangers of all these technologies, is that there's no guarantee that there's not extended frailty. The ancient Greek myths always warned us about that. You can become a grasshopper, croaking for eternity. You just lose your body.
Well, I've got the mic here fast. You raised a lot of tremendously important questions, but it seems to me you haven't helped answer them very well yet.
That's a strategy. I mean, you shouldn't have told them that.
And what I'm wondering about is if you've convinced me that in fact anti-aging is a bad idea and we ought to figure out ways to stop it, I wonder what your own sense of the stoppability of it is. I mean, it's just given the inequalities that you mentioned, the people wanting to live as long as they can, as healthy as they can, enormous amounts of money are available. We've got a baby boom generation just moving rapidly into that. Right. What do you predict will be the average lifespan of people 20 to 30 years from now, and where do you see it ending? Is there some biological limit, or is there a possibility of much longer lives, and is there any way to stop that process of calling on medicine to provide what we want it to provide, at least in the ways that we are thinking of what life should be?
There is a limit. There is a fixed limit, and it's about 120 years.
Do you know that?
Yes. That hasn't changed. And there may be some French woman who lives to 122, but it's really 120, and it's not changed. So I think it's unstoppable, myself. And there are different parts of it. There's the cosmetic surgery, enhancement. Let's take away every possible sign of physical aging that we can, which is so lucrative. And then there's the research to radically extend the lifespan. That may be stoppable. I think that it's possible that would be stoppable. Although, as you know, you can't control what happens in the private biotech labs, because all the regulation takes place in our universities, which receive federal money. Yeah, exactly.
Hi. Thank you. I'm interested back in the meaning of why should we try and have a long life. And back like the gentleman upstairs, I mean, I'll tell you a little bit of what, in one tradition, in the Tibetan Burn tradition that I study, they actually have a particular way of expressing this, and they talk about causal vehicles and result vehicles, in which, in the causal vehicles, things like medicine and so forth are for this life. And that the idea of to prolong life, it's worth if you do introspection and go into a spiritual life, both for your own benefit and for benefit of others. And I would like to have this as one voice in others, and how it would be, what would be the meanings of life, or doing a good enhancement, or aging, or a good aging, I would say. Does it make sense?
Yeah. My own view is that as we get older, we ought to continue to live in a covenantal way. Whatever tradition you're in a way of faithfulness to certain ideals that transcend you, that involve service, and as you say, that involve spiritual development. And in that sense, it really is possible that aging can coincide with becoming more fully human, because the fulfillment of your own character, the development, utter development of your talents, of your commitments, in the fullness of time, you become ageful. And I do think that coincides with what you said about the Tibetan tradition.
We live in a culture that glorifies youth, through advertisement, through just about every other thing. How would you fit that into to the problems that you're talking about now, that we don't really address that issue, that we could glorify old people? I mean, we glorify only youth. So how can we switch that around to not make it such a horrible thing, a scary thing to become older?
Well, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is more education about aging in the stages of life in our schools. From the pragmatic standpoint of, we have this crisis of obesity. Right? Well, what kind of diseases are these kids going to encounter? They're going to get emphysema and diabetes sooner than ever before. So education about the joys of waking up every day when you're old. Education about the possibilities of human interaction, combined with intergenerational schooling, more mentoring. There is a lot of mentoring that goes on in volunteer services, but I think we need more of that. And we need to just keep fighting the stereotypes. I mean, just like racism and sexism, we have to fight the stereotypes of ageism, just over and over and over and over. It's a never-ending battle.
With the lifespan increasing every year, could we not change the definition of middle age to going up to the age of 90, and then perhaps at 90 we would be elderly? So just expand the definition of middle age.
I think you'd have to expand the institutions that support middle age, because the reason we have 65 is because Bismarck picked it as the time of retirement when German social insurance was coming to be, because he knew most people didn't live to 65. So you have to have some, institutions that give a life stage a grip and activity in the world in order to make any change of definition have any traction.
We are all very glad for Dr. Cole's talk. I particularly was responding to the question on the glorification of youth as someone who works and lives in cultures that valorize old age, such that old age is a reward of just making it there because younger people, that's the point at which everybody listens to you. Everybody thinks you have something valuable to say, and you've spent your whole life having to defer to older people so you can get to that point yourself and be deferred to. And that sounds like a very nice model, and if we could get it with a compression of morbidity that you talked about, so no fragility, only wisdom, wouldn't that be a grand thing? So, Dr. Cole, thank you for giving us so much to think about. And thank you all for coming. And I'd like to say, just as the director of Scientia, I realize I neglected to introduce myself, but invite you to the reception outside to continue a conversation, and also to invite you to the next Scientia lecture, which will be Dr. Carol Quillen, Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, talking on humans after humanism, and that'll be on February 20th. We'll hope to see you then. Thank you very much.